Hello and welcome to another edition of Fide's podcast. My name is Jerry Serino and I'm your host, and I'm here with talent on loan from Rush. One of the key aspects of my show and one of the things that I preach is I preach freedom. Freedom is so essential, very, very sadly on our, specifically on our college campuses, but also, in the country in general. Freedom has taken a whole different term or definition these days, that's for sure. And there is a misunderstanding of freedom. One such person and one such group that does understand freedom of the individual, is my guest today, Marcus Thornton. He's the president of Feds for Freedom, and he's here to tell us about his organization and answer some questions about the issue of freedom from the government. So, Marcus, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Jerry, thanks for having me on today. It's a pleasure to join you. So our organization was founded in I have to do some math now. It's been so long. It was in late 2021, the day that President Biden issued the executive orders mandating the COVID vaccines for all federal workers, both direct hires and contractors. And the day that he issued those executive orders, we started the organization. It's a grassroots organization. We started out just through word of mouth. It was myself and a small group of colleagues from the State Department, as well as former colleagues with Homeland Security, and we all looked around at all of these institutions that were supposed to protect freedom against overreach, both within the government and outside of the government, and recognized very quickly that if we didn't stand up against the mandates, nobody else was going to stand up for us. And so we did. We decided to take the matters into our own hands, and had a really difficult time finding a law firm that would represent us. But eventually, we did. We found a couple of law firms that would work with us, and ended up through one of those cases with the injunction against the vaccine mandates that was put into place in January of 2022, and still remains in place to this day. That case is actually before the Supreme Court now. The Department of Justice appealed because they lost at the lower levels. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be interesting to see how those things play out. But we're confident that we are on the right side of history. Once you cede a right, a liberty to the government, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get that liberty back. And so we believe that it's important to stand up for our rights, not only for our rights as federal workers, but for the rights of all Americans. And we saw the administration tried to do the same thing, even in the private sector, to give an employer, to force an employer to mandate a medical decision for their worker, regardless of the individualized medical advice that person may have been getting from their medical provider. And so we believe that that's any decision when it comes to medical issues is a personal decision that should be between somebody and their medical provider, and that the employer or the government don't have a role to play in that.
Yeah, 100%. I think COVID was an eye opener for a lot of people. I've long since felt the government overreached in a lot of areas, and quite frankly, but this was one that was very concerning. And I think that the biggest, something you mentioned about in private employers, because obviously the government immediately, you saw military individuals who were let go, and people who worked, but most businesses, especially larger businesses, do business with the government in some way, shape, or form, right? With some government agency. And I think we saw it in a number of areas where government said, well, we won't do business with you if you can't ensure all your people are vaccinated, and so on. And so private businesses, we're almost forced to say, look, we either comply, or I don't know what we can do here. We're going to go out of business. And, we could fight it, but it's expensive. And that's the biggest challenge, is that government shouldn't even be in the realm of telling us to take a vaccine. Right. So the next question that comes up, and I'd love your comments on this, is that we now know, and that the vaccine, quite honestly, didn't work. It we were lied to about it. I mean, President Biden is on record saying, take the vaccine, you won't get COVID and you won't transmit COVID. That was a lie. We know it. And we know it also, there's lots of evidence that it has done health damage. There's been health damage for young people, especially, you know, yet they don't come back and say, oops, we made a mistake. And I think that goes to your point about once you cede, you cede our rights to the government, they're never going to give it to us back. Do you see that ever changing? Do you see the government coming forward and saying we were wrong?
I don't think there will ever be an admission of guilt, but the optimal outcome that we can hope for is that the courts uh, issue a ruling at the highest levels that says that what happened was unacceptable, that it was a violation of our constitutional and religious freedoms, and and word that in a way that it prevents a recurrence of what we went through. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. We were lied to about the safety. We were lied to about the efficiency. And not only that, we were lied to about the availability of the products themselves. For months, years, we were told, this is an FDA approved product. It's not emergency use, and so there's no reason for you to continue to object to it on that basis. And come to find out, we actually did we did our homework. We did some research and found that although the FDA had approved the Comirnaty vax, that vaccine was never uh, released for public use in the U.S. And so, they had a product that they were saying was functionally equivalent, but there was still a legal distinction. And the product that was being released was in fact the emergency use only product. Even the one that the military members were forced to take was the emergency use only. And we went through this with the anthrax vaccine a while back, a couple of administrations ago, and the courts were very clear, and even Congress passed legislation saying, this was unacceptable, what happened, and should never happen again. And so there were fairly robust protections put into place to ensure that nobody ever had to take an emergency use experimental authorization product again. And they tried to get around that with the COVID vaccine by saying, well, actually, there is a product that's FDA approved, even while they were, releasing a product and distributing a product, injecting people with a product that was not FDA approved. And so they did a bait and switch, in particular for the military members. And, it's the fact that we couldn't even have an honest conversation about these things until the last few months is completely unacceptable. The censorship, shadow banning, deplatforming that we've seen not only within our organization, but across the spectrum. Anybody who dared to challenge the narrative on these matters, even though we were speaking truth, we were very quickly told that we were spreading dangerous misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And come to find out that censorship, as we're seeing in Missouri v. Biden, was actually in many cases at the request of the U.S. government, of the very entities that we were pursuing legal remedy against.
Yep. Yeah, it's actually a great segue because that's where I was going to go with you is that we also had simultaneously we had censorship of just discussions, people asking, wanting to know information about the vaccines, the FDA, the studies that were done. We know that, and maybe you can comment on this since you've obviously been pretty involved. There's the pharmaceutical companies are not required to release all of the information about what went into the study, the adverse effects during the study, and things like that. And that's very concerning because all people wanted to do was ask questions, make some points, question what the government was doing, or what the pharmaceutical companies were doing, and people were censored. So you couldn't even have the conversation. And that's not freedom, right? That is the opposite of freedom when you have that going on. And it's really, really concerning to me. There was even lots of censorship, I know, regarding therapeutics for COVID, such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. There were lies about it, censorship. Doctors' lives were destroyed who even just brought it up as hey, it's a viable option. And all he wanted to push was the vaccine. So from a legal standpoint, in part of the reason why we don't like government, mandating these things is that if in fact a private company on its own put forward a product and they lied about it, right? The consumer, the public has recourse. They can be sued. So it's a deterrent for a company to put forward a false product, right? Because they know they're going to get sued. The leaders of the company could even be imprisoned, right? If they're committing fraud and things like that. And it has happened. In the case of government doing it, there's never recourse. Who do you go to be made whole for this? If you're a patient, who do you go to?
Yeah, and that's the really challenging part about this. Full disclosure, I'm not an attorney. I'm just a guy who wanted to preserve my rights and decided that I needed to hire some attorneys to make that happen. But
Mhm.
when you look at what has happened over the last few years, and that was the whole thing with the Comirnaty vaccine, right? The product that
Mhm.
they released was legally distinct from the one that was FDA authorized, and so the manufacturer couldn't be held liable for any side effects or any adverse reaction that somebody would have to the product that they were injected with. And so that's where, where there is risk, there must be choice. And
Mhm.
and that choice was taken out of our hands over the past couple of years. What we found in the process of fighting this battle was that the vaccine mandates were just one symptom of deeper root issues within our government, and that's where we get into the censorship and everything else. And that is that our government, as it is now, the is primarily consists of a unelected bureaucracy that is not reflective of the values of the people that it serves.
Mhm.
They're unaccountable, untransparent, and if we want to change the way that our government is run and make sure that COVID lockdowns and mandates don't happen again in the future with some other issue, we have to address those root issues. And so that's where we're at as an organization. That's what we're pushing for and fighting for, because we can, even if we get rid of the mandates and make sure that the lockdowns aren't going to happen, there's nothing that prevents them from happening again if we don't have a government that's reflective of our values. And so um, as far as like actually holding people accountable for it is really hard. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but you know, there are very limited circumstances where you can hold government officials accountable in their personal capacity for actions that they take that harm other people.
Mhm.
And but that is one of the things that we're trying to do through our legal actions. We've got a lot of different lawsuits in the works right now. Some of those are against government officials in both their official and personal capacities, and that's under a provision called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which in a nutshell is that if a government official violates religious freedoms while acting in their official capacity, um, essentially, to put it in layman's terms, essentially they're acting beyond the scope of their authority and can be held liable in their personal capacity. And so we're trying to do that. But I think to really change the culture, that's what we have to have is we have to have accountability at the individual level. We have to let people know and send a very clear message that just following orders is never an acceptable defense.
Mhm.
Uh, Liberties are not something to be trifled with. They're so fundamental to our society that they were enshrined in our founding documents, and it's not something that we can just suspend out of convenience or perceived convenience
Mhm.
in a state of emergency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, I want to point out that, why is it that people who work for the government, as you said, in unelected bureaucracies, why is it that they're free to essentially do whatever they want? Whereas, again, a private company, CEOs and executives at companies have gone to jail for fraud, accounting fraud, all sorts of things. I mean, there's cases everywhere. Businesses, companies are highly, highly regulated and do things. They have legal advice. They do things or don't do things out of fear of being sued or even imprisoned. And we have that happen. Yet government officials can continually commit fraud and nothing happens. And that's
Yeah,
why we need, it's like the fox watching the hen house, right?
it really is, and we need to bring that level of fear and accountability that we have in the private sector and bring that to government. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. You can fight it in the courts. You can also you can pass legislation that holds agencies to a higher standard, and then Congress can also get involved in oversight in an oversight type capacity, and we are seeing some of that.
Yep. Yep. But it's tough to do because there's
It
so
is
many
tough.
so many
It's
dishonest
incredibly tough.
people. Yeah. So I want to get into maybe a little bit about yourself and your background. It's on your website. I'm actually gonna scroll the website here for those that are interested. It's fedsforfreedom.org. Feel free, go there, check it out. It's a really nice looking. That's what I'm looking at when I'm looking to my right here. At the website, it's a really nice website. Great information. If you want to get involved or support, please do. That's what we need to do for organizations such as yours, because they are so important. You and others like you speak for us and help protect our rights. But I want to ask, just started with a little bit of your background. Tell me about your background. It's an interesting and good background, and we'd love to know.
Yeah. So I have 16 years of public service. I started out with the Department of Homeland Security and was with Homeland Security for several years. Primarily, most of that time was as a Border Patrol agent, and I was down on the border with Mexico, and then eventually in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And so, fighting against human trafficking, disrupting human trafficking, and other organized crime elements, and doing everything that I could to keep Americans safe and to fight for the most vulnerable in society. And that those desires, that fight has continued throughout the rest of my career. Um, I'm now with the State Department. Obviously, the opinions that I'm sharing today are my personal opinions and not reflective of any official position. But I've continued to fight for human rights, for religious freedom in my role with the State Department. Those are things that are important to me, and I've you know been in the right place at the right time to be able to make some real impacts in those areas. And so it was just sort of a natural continuation of that when these mandates came up and people were looking for help. That
Mhm.
I saw an opportunity to help, and between myself and the other founders of the organization, we I don't think any of us expected it to take this long to see the results that we've seen, but I also don't think that any of us expected for this thing to become as big as it did. The idea in the beginning was just, hey, let's come together and we'll split the expenses, hire a lawyer, and do what we can. And then from there, just through word of mouth and grassroots, we very quickly grew to almost 9,000, now almost 10,000 federal employees and contractors across every segment of government, standing up for the liberties of Americans. And
Mhm.
I really have enjoyed my career. I've been able to live in some amazing places and do amazing work with amazing people. Um, but the thing that has always been first and foremost on my mind is making sure that what I do helps the people back home, that it helps the
Mhm.
American people, that it helps them stay safe, that it promotes American values and American interests. And if we want to have a government um, that is truly reflective of our values, then we need to have people from all sides of the political spectrum participating in those processes and agencies, being part of the bureaucracy. Um, you know, there's a perception that the government only serves one side of the political spectrum, and that's not an unfair criticism. But the way we fix that is we have to do a number of things. One, we have to get involved at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. We have to be involved in politics if we want politics to change. But then beyond that, we also need to have people in the military, in the government agencies, that are going to represent that full diversity of political views. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past couple of years is the pushing out of anybody that doesn't comply with the accepted narrative. So we're hoping to fix that in whatever way we can as an organization. It is an uphill battle, just like fighting the mandates was an uphill battle. But I don't believe we've ever had an organization of insiders fighting for accountability like ours. It's usually and justifiably so. People are very hesitant to speak up when you have a relatively secure career with good good benefits and job stability, job security. It's hard to risk that, to stand up for what's right. And but that would be my message to anybody who's listening today who is in the government or in the military. It only takes a handful of people standing up and saying, this is wrong, this is not what America stands for, to make a real difference and to make a real impact. And that's what we have to keep in mind both now and for future generations. Things don't change unless you make them change, and there are a lot of different things that you can do to do that. You can get involved yourself. You can support organizations like Feds for Freedom that are on the front lines fighting the fight. Be informed by listening to podcasts such as this, and that would be my message to the listeners is, just do those things, and you'll be surprised at what you can accomplish.
Yep. Well, and everyone has their role. I think it's a really good point about getting involved. Not everyone's meant to say do what you do or do what I'm doing. My sister just ran and won her for her city for school board. My dad is a
Nice.
state senator. Many people are, maybe just volunteer for a campaign or for a particular group or cause. Some people just, even if that none of that is for you, stay informed and be able to articulate our beliefs and opinions when challenged out there, because I think a lot of times people are fearful of challenging their coworkers and other people that they may come across. And being involved in whatever way you're called to. Everyone's got a different skill set or interest or desire or whatever. We have to be involved because this is serious. I mean, let's not forget what happened with just with COVID, right? I mean, people were forced to take something they didn't want or need, right? People lost their jobs over it or were threatened with their job. Schools were closed, kids were adversely affected big time. Businesses were shut down. Our country, spent trillions of dollars dealing with COVID in general. And, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So maybe, my last, question for you is, what other areas? So, obviously COVID and the vaccine was sort of, as I said, an eye opener, maybe for a lot of people. But what other dangers are we facing out there of government overreach? I mean, it seems like it's everything. You mentioned the border, your experience as in dealing with the border. What else are we being hit with as far as government overreach?
It really is everything, and it's hard to even know where to begin. I mean, when you look at censorship, that's something that the government should never be in the business of engaging in. And I'm cautiously optimistic that through Missouri v. Biden, there will be some correction in that area. But again, it goes back to needing to have representation in the bureaucracy. We would never have engaged in that sort of censorship if we had good people within the bureaucracy pushing back on those policies and serving as whistleblowers, going to Congress and to the American people and talking about what the government was doing. So censorship is certainly one of the biggest ones. I think the border and national security is an area of incredible concern for a lot of different reasons. And if we don't get that under control, then that opens up a whole can of worms of bad things that could happen to Americans. When I was working on the border, it what motivated me and drove me as I went to work every day was knowing that I was, just myself, one agent out of tens of thousands of agents. Um, I arrested. I, I lost count of how many people that I arrested on the border who were trying to enter the country illegally, who were convicted sex offenders, convicted, you know, violent criminals, drug smugglers, you name it, people that were involved with the cartels. And so, it's not just people coming to pursue economic advantage or a better life or the American dream. There are very dangerous people that every single day are crossing that border. And so we can't just look at it through the economic lens. You have to look at it through the national security lens and the risk that that poses to national security. I think our immigration system obviously needs a lot of work, but but that's something that Congress is going to have to address. There are a lot of laws on the books that could make significant progress towards addressing these issues in the border security that are simply not being enforced, and so that's another issue.
So,
But as far as government overreach, censorship and these mandates were by far the most obvious ones. I think another area to look out for is the digital currency, digital banking. I think there's a lot of concern in that area over the ways that the government could take control of our finances. If what you're looking at is essentially a social credit score, where if you do something that doesn't fall in line with the way that the government thinks you should be behaving, they can flip a switch and cut off all your access to finances, and track all of those purchases and transactions. And so, the fight for liberty is a constant fight, and we're never. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said something along the lines of, we're never more than one generation away from losing the liberties that our ancestors have fought and bled and died for. And it's on us to fight, to continue that fight, and to continue to secure those liberties, not only for our generation, but for countless generations to come. And, if we don't do that here in America, then there's not a whole lot of hope for the rest of the world.
Yeah, perfect way to end it. That is so true, because we are sort of like the last hope to a lot of to our world in a lot of ways, because of our size, our power, our wealth, and we're losing those freedoms and consequently losing our stance in the world, which impacts other smaller countries that are trying to rise up. And unfortunately, whether it's in society in general, or especially in our college campuses, where kids are being just overwhelmed with misinformation. I always think, like, look at the first two amendments to our Constitution, right? And what our government has done to inhibit our freedoms, and those two: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. I mean, the government is attacking all of those. Those are just the first two. Imagine if we let them keep going, what they would do to those two amendments, and as well as other of our God-given rights, and of which, by the way, the government is in place to protect those rights, right? That's what they're there to do, and the government is limited in what they're supposed to be doing or allowed to be doing, in which is what Marcus and Feds for Freedom is fighting to keep government at bay. And it's you're right, it's a never-ending fight, that's for sure. So Marcus Thornton, president of Feds for Freedom. Please go to fedsforfreedom.org and check it out, learn more, and support and follow Marcus as well, and the organization. And Marcus, really great insight, great stuff. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and your all the work that Feds for Freedom is doing.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank all of you for listening to this episode of Fides Podcast. Please check out all my podcasts and all the different podcast apps on YouTube, on Rumble, on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on rightamericamedia.com. and on WHK radio /podcast.com as well. So thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.